So welcome, Jane.
Well, thank you for the lovely introduction. And also, of course, it's really nice to have the University of Manitoba plugged in because that's where I did my undergrad. So that's really cool. And I worked with Stephanie Forte. It was my first job as an RA. So thanks for being here and inviting me. So I'm going to talk today about the development and application of computational approaches to moving habitat models in 1 and 2 dimensions. I didn't know what university to put on my slides, so I put them all. I'm actually also starting at Oregon State University, and we'll be moving there very shortly. So the email that I'll more likely, if you're interested in connecting with me, keep up with the most is the one that's on the slide now. So let's start. All right. So just to give you an idea of what I'll be talking about, I'm going to run you through the overview first. I'm going to start with an introduction to what moving habitat models are and what they're motivated by and what they're for. Particularly starting with foundational models. So just to give you a kind of quick little idea, we have something with a suitable habitat bounded by temperature isoclines, which are shifting in space. And the foundational model lets the points of these isoclines, CT and L plus CT. So I worked in a model that used also these temperature isocline replacements and movement equations, but I was interested eventually in doing something more general, which led me to computational studies of the model. And so I will talk about why I was interested in computational studies, what motivates them, and what are the models, the equations that I write down to use or to do a computational study for, and introduce you to a scheme in 1 dimension, one spatial dimension being a finite difference scheme, and also a hybrid finite element method in 2 dimensions. So this you can see would be density over a spatial grid for a finite element method. And one of the things that you can see here is there's a jump in density. And so this would be a good motivator to look at computational methods. And I'll talk about where these jumps in densities come from. And then finally, I'll talk about several different applications. And being the other good motivator, generalizing this shifting speed to whatever you want that's motivated, of course, by something that we see. So one of the things that we see in this world are accelerating speeds of climate change. So I'll talk about an application that's motivated with or supported by the computational study. And then I'll talk here. Okay, so let's jump into the introduction. So here, we were thinking about climate change, shifting temperature isoclines forward or upwards in altitude. Now, many or almost all species or all species have temperature as a characteristic that is going to help define its suitable habitats. And so there's isocline bounds that will shift this suitable habitat accordingly upwards in altitude or latitude. So here we have a projection of maple tree ideal habitats into the future, right? So this is current, this is the projection. And these are the tapped trees that are currently tapped in Canada. Now, the projection places basically all of our tapped trees outside of the ideal habitat. Of course, economically, Canada will have to respond to that because we have a whole system for maple syrup, a whole economy on maple, well, not a whole economy, but we do have an economy on maple syrup. Not just humans have to respond, but also species are responding, and they correspondingly with range shifts. So here we can see the change in latitude of the bird center of abundance. This figure is referencing how it is corresponding to temperature shifts as well. So you can see this is moving northward or poleward. And here, this is showing where the center of abundance is for a bunch of different flora on mountains, and you can see most of them are moving upwards in altitude. So we're interested in asking then, what are the mechanisms that support these range shifts, so successful range shifts, being able to stay within the suitable habitat? And in the case that they do, what are the impacts on the population abundance in these shifting habitats? So to start, we can formulate a mathematical model where we are going to first in 1D cut our space into suitable and unsuitable habitat. So we see that bounded suitable habitat and the unsuitable habitat around it is yellow. And over top of that spatial domain, I will place my PDE. Now, because these interfaces are shifting, I have a trailing edge and a leading edge shifting in time, described by L1 and L2T. And since on average, they are shifting unidirectionally, I will always call L1 a trailing edge and L2 a leading edge. And then suitability is determined by the demographics. So where if the habitat is suitable, we'll see the logistic equation. So on its own, the logistic equation shows that growth is supported in that space, and linear mortality outside, and then population changes in time due to the demographics and diffusion. So this is the model that we're interested in. Okay, so the foundational model, like I said, took L1 to be CT and L2 to be L plus CT. So this is what I will call the constant matching speeds case. Because within this framework, our habitat stays the same size for all time, and it shifts at this constant speed for all time. And you can see it's going towards the higher altitudes or latitudes. And in this framework, we can establish a lot of analytical persistence results. So this is what is called asymptotic analysis. So we say, okay, go forward in time. When do we see the population persist? Or when we frame this mathematically, we're asking, when do we see the zero steady state become unstable? So turns out there is a critical speed, C star, such that for all speeds C less than C star, there exists a finite critical patch size, for which the population persists for all L greater than L star, where L star is your critical patch size. So what is that? That means that if C is less than C star, then there is a size, a minimal size for our patch, right, that will be able to support growth at low densities. That's what we call persistence. And for any C greater than C star, the population will go. When we are in the case of persistence, the population is a traveling pulse. It takes on this profile and just shifts in time as this constant profile. Okay, we can complement these results with a computational study where we simulate the model. And what we can find with these computational studies is that, in fact, abundance can benefit from the shift. So there is an intermediate speed C for which the population, which I'm calling TP, total population, reaches the maximum. So this here is when there is no shift and I'm increasing the speed C. So this would be like a stationary domain. We're increasing the speed C, and we see that our curve is half-shaped for the total population. Okay, so we are interested in understanding why that happens. Well, here we can do the ratio of the total population inside the suitable habitat over the entire total population. And we see that's actually decreasing. So what's happening here is that our total population is actually expanding outside, or it's getting, there's an increase in abundance due to an increased abundance outside the suitable habitat. So what we are seeing is actually a reduction in competitive pressure inside the suitable habitat, which increases productivity inside the suitable habitat. You'll also note that here, by going down these lines, I'm increasing mortality. And so this increased abundance vanishes if I take mortality too high outside the suitable habitat. So when we couple this reduced competitive pressure with low mortality rates outside, we have then this increased abundance. Okay, so we have, what I want to say is we have this like large trailing edge behavior, and it'll come up again soon. Okay, so why computational studies? Kind of give you a little bit of an idea why, right? We can complement our analytical results with computational studies and study things like abundance, or study concepts outside of persistence analysis or an existence of solutions. Well, some of the things that I'm interested in doing today are talking about movement response to habitat. So this is a specialist butterfly and its response to its preferred habitat, meaning that it has certain flora that it prefers over others, is that it will bias its movement towards its preferred habitat. This is in contrast to something like the monarch butterfly, which is a jump. Additionally, the average of the climate speed is clear in this general trend, right? But the actual trend is that it oscillates around the average. And topographical features can change the size of a suitable habitat. And also, of course, landscapes are heterogeneous in all directions. So none of these things that I'm talking about right now on this slide are captured in that 1D foundational model. So these are the ideas that are motivating the building of the computational model. So first, let's talk about habitat movement. So habitat movement or habitat-dependent movement behavior is introduced into the model at the interfaces with a bias. So individual moves into the suitable habitat with probability alpha or beta, and outside with 1 minus alpha or 1 minus beta. And as well, we can differ diffusion rates across habitat types. And now I reintroduce L1 and L2 as kind of user-defined equations that we explicitly define before we start our study, but are defined just through whatever application we're interested in. So there is a mistake on this slide. Ignore this, just call it K1 and then let it be this, just this equation here, sorry about that. But K1, this movement behavior here is reflected into the equations by a jump in density across the interface. So as we saw before, our traveling pulse was continuous in space, but now we can see jumps in density at the interface. And K or K1 or K2 is the jump proportionality coefficient. And these last equations are flux. They just say that flux is continuous across the interface. So this is the two-dimensional model I work with. It is the analog of the one-dimensional model. And some features that you might notice are different is that we now only have 2 subdomains, the bounded and outside. So in the 1D, of course, we have 2 outside domains, but now the outside domain is just itself, and we could let it move in space. So this would be it at a later time here, where the suitable habitat maybe is smaller, and also the interfaces maybe changed shape. Okay. So what does movement response to habitat do? Turns out we can actually also study this analytically when we take CT and L plus CT to be our movement of the interfaces. This is K1 or K2. I guess I called it K alpha now on this slide. Apologize for the inconsistency there. But you'll notice that the habitat bias and the diffusion rates are defining our proportionality cost. And in this case, we can say that for every shifting speed C, there exists a large enough habitat bias and dispersal rate C1 such that there is a finite critical path size. In other words, we think about alpha, right? It's a probability that it approach 1. Then essentially what we're applying here is a Neumann boundary condition, because it then says that if an individual comes to the suitable habitat or comes to the interface, it will always rebound back in. So as we approach a Neumann boundary condition, right, we have higher persistence probability. And if there was only a Neumann boundary condition here, right, then we should see persistence because we wouldn't lose anybody at the trailing edge. Okay. So it also turns out, this is a theorem in a picture, that the profile is also a traveling pulse, and the traveling pulse can take on many different shapes. It can take on a shape where the local maximum is inside the suitable habitat. It can take on a shape where the local maximum is on, or inside the suitable habitat is on the interface and decreases inside the suitable habitat. And it depends on C and the jump coefficient and this quantity Q. So whenever K alpha is less than 1, then your local max is always inside. If K alpha is greater than 1, then it depends on the sign of Q. Q is dependent on trailing edge parameters and the speed. And if C is greater than C star, so in this case, it's a non-dimensional model, C star is equal to 2, that's the critical speed. If C is greater than C star, then it will always take on this decreasing profile. So we can see these kinds of bunching at the trailing edge section. Okay, so this is the last of the analytical results I will show you, and let's jump now into the computational methods. Computational methods for these moving habitat models are complicated by the fact that we want to be able to look at general shifting speeds. I want to be able to say, I'm interested in accelerating. I'm interested in periodically varying speeds. So I need something that can deal with that. And additionally, that can deal with these jumps. So, and also, for example, large gradients. Now, the first thing we can fix is the movement of the interfaces. And that's going to make it easier for me to develop my computational method. So we fix the interfaces first. And we can do this for both methods, the finite difference one and the hybrid one. So that's why I kept it outside. So how do we fix the interfaces? The first thing we do is recognize that we can build a mapping between two coordinate systems. In one coordinate system, the first one we saw already, where I've already defined our equation, the interfaces are moving in space. In the other coordinate system, they are fixed in space. I will call the one where they move in space the physical space, and the one where they're fixed the reference frame. In 1D, a general mapping that works is this one. So L1 and L2 can be defined as we wish. There's some restrictions on it. But in general, can be defined in this way. And this will bring us to the reference frame where I build the computational method. And in 2D, it's a lot more complicated, but you can, for example, in the case where you have constant speed, do what we've done in the past with, or do what you would imagine you would do for this constant shifting speed, right? And you can see how phi would be defined. But in general, it's quite more complicated to define mapping in the 2D space. However, for the fixed coordinate system, when we restate our equations, we end up with coefficients that are dependent on both space and time, and also an additional event. So we switch moving interfaces for a more complicated relation. However, we prefer this. Okay, so let's start with the finite difference scheme. All right, the finite difference scheme is going to capture the accuracy of the interfaces, the jump in the interfaces, by placing two nodes on each interface. So you can think about essentially discretizing those limiting equations and adding them into A, which is going to be our linear operator that is approximating the coefficients or approximating the derivatives. Then we're also, as you can see here, because we're thinking about large gradients, but also flat solutions out at the end, not going to fix ourselves with a uniform mesh, but allow our mesh to be non-uniform. In this way, we can define a finite difference scheme that looks like this expression, where we have a forward-backward or a forward-backward scheme, because I'm taking the nonlinear in F, so I'm keeping that as a forward step, but I'm doing a backward step here. As you can see, I put my time step is forward on the spatial, but is it's backward on the spatial, but forward on the nonlinear. And M is just a matrix that's diagonal, so that all of the error is with ones on the diagonal, so that all of the time-dependent equations would be with the one, and is 0 whenever I'm talking about a boundary condition or an interface condition, because those conditions are independent of time. All right, so in general, it looks like this. And this scheme is both first order in space and time. So to validate it, we can do a grid independent study. So in this case, what you do first is you want to make sure that it can actually capture all of the analytical results that you have. Do you see persistence when you expect persistence? Do you see extinction when you expect extinction? Also, are the profiles like they should, right? I have those 4 distinct profiles. I know exactly when they should look like, what they should look like. Can my finite difference model capture that? Yes, good. So additionally, we want to make sure that the method is convergent. So in this way, what you can do is obtain a reference solution. We don't have an exact solution to look at. So we can obtain a reference solution. You do that by taking a fine grid and simulating over the fine grid. And then you show convergence to the reference solution. So here's 2 different parameter sets, S1 and S2. You saw them before previously. 2 different profiles, one being a kind of simpler profile. Gradients are a lot more easier, right? Gradient is pretty severe over here. And we see in both cases that convergence happens, although keep in mind, we need to be able to reach below, let's say 1%, we need a finer grid when we have these larger gradients. And also for the temporal, we need to keep in mind that this is for S2. So this is for different, this is the relative error as we go forward in time for different spatial discretization. So if we want to have a good qualitative quantitative result, then we need to all keep in mind that our time step for harder cases will maybe have to be small. And this is also first order. All that being said, it is still very efficient and accurate. Okay, so the 2D hybrid finite element. All right, so when you do a finite element method, the first thing you always have to do is write it in a variational form. So the variational form means that you're going to ask for solutions in a weaker sense and define a bilinear functional and in the case of a hybrid variational form, you actually define as additionally this bilinear functional 2, which is I'm calling B. So in this case, what we have is kind of similar to what I did in 1D anyways. Because remember, I put two nodes on my interface so that I could stick my equations inside my difference equation. So I don't have to strongly impose my interface equations. They're solved for. This is doing that exact same thing. I'm weakly imposing my interface conditions. So I don't have to strongly impose them on my functional spaces. So these are my function spaces here. And you can see that I don't have in X where my solution should lie, right? My interface conditions imposed, because they're being captured by the addition of B1 and B5. i.e., when we solve for lambda, we find that it's actually the flux. Okay. Now, we are able to obtain theoretical results for the error analysis when C is equal to 0, i.e., there's the suitable habitat is stationary, it's not moving. And these are optimal error estimates, and they say that, for example, if we take linear, S would be the polynomial order. So if you take a linear element, i.e., here's my grid, I'm going to put a linear plane on each single element here, okay? And I will add them all together, and that will be my solution, right? So this is a finite element method. I'm just going to add all my solutions together in these as approximated by these linear planes. So if it's linear, right, and my solutions inside the suitable and unsuitable habitat are in the Sobolev space H2, then I should expect linear order convergence in H1 seminar, or in the H1 norm. That's what this is. So, great. That's for stationary. Of course, I want to do this with a moving C, right? I want my habitats to be moving. Well, turns out that we do this grid independent study again. With C non-zero, we still obtain the expected error, where we have the semi-norm, this is measured in the H1 norm. Here we have linear order as expected, and here we can do as well an L2 error, estimate that, and we see second order convergence. And this is true for both conformal and non-conformal meshes. What do I mean by that? Essentially, think about it as being like a non-uniform grid in some sense, okay? I have a fine grid out inside and a less fine grid outside, and I don't have to have, if you look here, for example, right? They don't have to share vertices across the interface. This is what I mean by non-conformal, okay? So, oops. All right. So these are the methods that I developed and used to support computational studies. So let's go into application. So can you see? Oh, this has been here. Okay, sorry. Okay, is it good now? Okay, so.
Click on the OK, and that'll disappear.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, it's all. Yeah,
Okay,
there we go.
okay. Okay. So the metrics that I'm going to use for application, I've introduced one of them already. I called it total population. What is that? It's just when I integrate underneath my profile curve. Okay. Also, I have a range threshold. So let's say you're out in the field, you're looking for animals or a species, right? There would be a density below which you would find it very difficult to detect them, right? So this would be the range threshold. And then the range is the largest interval in which the population profile exceeds that. threshold. I'm going to use these to define my metrics, or to make inference and understand my systems and why they do what they do. And additionally, I'm going to often make comparisons against this constant matching speed case. Okay, so as before, when I made the comparison in abundance for stationary versus moving, I'm now going to say, let me start with this moving constant matching and then use that as my initial condition and then change it by introducing a different movement of the interface. Okay, so the first one we will look at is accelerating speeds. Okay, so in this case, the suitable habitat stays the same for all time. However, stays the same size for all time. However, the speed at which the interfaces move is accelerated. So this is how I express this mathematically, where L1t is equal to t to the x1 plus epsilon, and L2 is just L1t plus L. And so epsilon is like my acceleration parameter. So, of course, everything that we do should be motivated by something that we see. We are mathematicians, right? So, over the last decade or so, climate change has been happening faster, right? So, we're seeing this accelerating speed of climate change, and our results with that foundational model, right, where we have the constant traveling speeds, or sorry, constant traveling speed, we know that eventually, if this were to continue for all time, this acceleration, right, that the population will be doomed, because eventually it will be faster than the average, than that average speed, or that critical speed. So there are lots of conservation efforts out there. This is a recent one that I came across. I don't know how super recent it is, but it's kind of recent. I think within the last 2 years, there's this report that came out for the potential for assisted migration of coastal redwood to Vancouver Island. So I thought that was relevant to us all here and you living here. Of course, that could bring a lot of other problems and prospects, but these are things that we want to be able to recognize for the species, right? What are the transient dynamics? And now we can recognize who needs conservation efforts as such, right? And who maybe will be okay. So, to identify mechanisms that affect this time to extinction, I define this time to extinction by the total population equaling some low value E, right? And also is decreasing. Oh. So here we can see my time to extinction as a function of my acceleration parameter epsilon. And I'm considering my 1D system where I have my alpha parameter, that bias at the trailing edge, right? So in all cases, the time to extinction is decreasing. Okay, so if we increase the acceleration parameter, right, then the time to extinction is earlier. Okay, right? Not so surprising. But what is interesting here is this kind of switch behavior, right? Where, or this non-monotone behavior in alpha, right? Where we have high alphas, low alphas having a lower time to extinction in some parameter range over here for epsilon, meaning a lower bias for lower epsilons, we see a sooner time to extinction. And the switch is in this range over here for epsilon, where in fact, now the high bias is more detrimental to the population. So let's look at this a little bit closer. Here we can see epsilon being in that lower range across the top, and epsilon being in higher range across the bottom, and two different parameters for alpha, one being low, one being high, low in the first column, high. And we see two different behaviors, where the first one is low acceleration rate, low bias. The population detaches, right, from the suitable habitat. There's this like big detachment from the suitable habitat eventually. It attempts to follow, but it detaches ultimately. And with that same acceleration parameter, we don't really get that for the high bias, right? It does a much better job at staying attached to the suitable habitat. It still, of course, reaches that extinction state, but it does so later, and it seems that that high bias helps it stay much closer and better attached. However, when we increase the acceleration parameter and look at those same two probabilities for bias, right, we see detachment in both cases. What's different is that the low bias has a much bigger trailing population. And the size of the trailing population is what sustains it for longer. Whereas here, in the case where the high bias ends up depleting its trailing population, so when it detaches, its population levels are lower, and so reach extinction soon. All right, so we, of course, would be tempting to say, oh, high bias should help a population in all cases, but what we see here is that's certainly not true, and species with high bias will require also a large conservation effort in the case of, or in times of accelerating climate change. All right, so now we can do another application. So incorporating fluctuation through the interfaces is what I'm going to look at here. So I mean, here we have L1 and L2 being those average speeds, right? If they were able to CT and alpha CT, and oscillations around that. There's two ways I can do that. Either, well, of course, there's many ways. I'm going to talk about two ways that I did it. One way is they oscillate at the same period and in the same, they're in phase. Okay, so the period is the same and the amplitude is the same. And that keeps the suitable habitat the same size. The alternative way is that they're in this anti-phase. So the amplitude and the period are the same, but opposite. So the period's the same, but the amplitude is opposite. The sign is opposite. And so in that case, we see also it fluctuating in size. All right. So the period is going to be defined by t, and when would we see this kind of fluctuation in size? Well, seasonal, you can imagine, of course, might be one of the reasons why, but also topographical changes can make that happen. For example, if we're moving upwards, a mountain slope, right? When the slope changes, here are the temperature isoclines at a certain time, right? It changes the size of the suitable habitat because the slope has changed, and so more or less habitat is available. So I'm going to call this case where like the slope never changes, right? Or we're in phase, the constant niche size case, and then the variable niche size case when we're out of in that anti-phase, or you can kind of think about it as this case where we have varying slopes. Okay. I'm also going to distinguish between timescales here. There's long-lived species. So when t, the period, is small, we are going to consider the fluctuations being short compared to the life cycle of this. And short-lived species, I'm going to say that when I mean t is large, i.e. the fluctuations are long compared to the life cycle of the species. So in this case, you can see two pictures. So here we can see that the period is very small. So this would be a long-lived species case. This would be the result of simulation for a long-lived species, and short-lived species our periods are much bigger. So you can identify them. Perfect. So there are some analytical results for periodically varying speeds done by Chen et al. And they looked at fluctuation in location and speed. So not the varying ones, but this would fit the in phase case. And they find that there exists a critical amplitude. So the largest amplitude of the fluctuations, or the largest the amplitude of the fluctuations can be before the population goes to extinction or the zero steady state becomes stable. Okay. I.e., start with no fluctuations moving, add fluctuation, then increase the amplitude. Eventually, you will reach an amplitude in which your population is now in the or when which the zero steady state is now stable and the population goes. So this would be our case when we have unstable zero steady state, and this would be for persistence, and a case where it is unstable, or when it is stable. In the case that it is stable, we see what is a periodic traveling pulse. So it's going to change its profile periodically, but every period will be, yeah, 5 minutes left. Oh, okay, sorry.
We're a bit less actually.
Oh, okay, sorry, okay. Okay, so, I'm sorry. Okay, so let me then jump forward. I'm going to talk only about abundance in this case, but the main story that I want, or the main takeaway that I want to give here is that with a constant niche size, we can see increase in population abundance compared to the case of no variation. Okay, so in that case, what we're seeing is essentially a kind of compounding effect of what we saw previously with that increased abundance, right? We have this large trailing edge, but we're also periodically going back to it, which means that individuals who are left behind are then repeatedly giving opportunities to contribute to growth again. But we still also have that reduction in competitive pressure. And so we now have a kind of hump shape for our total population as a function of amplitude as well. And for long-lived species, this is more apparent. For the very niche size case, and this is true, sorry, this is true not just for the maximum abundances, because this is a periodic one, right? But also minimum, meaning that over the whole periodic interval, the population can exceed the total abundance without variation. For the very niche size case, the story is different. Only the maximum will go above if it does. And in the case of long-lived species, we don't really see this at all. So why is that? Well, short-lived species are much better able to react, right? Here we see, if you look at this profile underneath the periodic change of the suitable habitat, it looks very close to what you could maybe imagine is a constant traveling pulse, right? It's very little variation in its pulse and or profile. So you get this kind of averaging effect, right? But with that compound of total abundance effect. Whereas for the short-lived species, they're much more reactive, meaning that they go where and when it is suitable. And they're able to react because they're shorter lives. Now, the other phenomenon we see for the short-lived species is this bottleneck. So remember, they're much more reactive. They see these deep troughs during times of contraction, but the reaction allows them to actually establish these traveling fronts during times of expansion. associated to those larger population sizes, and these traveling funds actually approach the Fisher speed. Mortality matters. These are all with reference to low mortality, okay? You cannot have high mortality and see an increased abundance with these kind of variation. And I guess I will skip this one because I have no time, sorry. It's preliminary anyways, so that's okay, but we do have for the 2D some simulations for a shrinking domain. So this would be something I'm interested in doing. But let me conclude. I'm with Silas, you're laughing there. I'm working on some preliminary work as well with a 2 morphs model. So introducing habitat bias. So you have the same species, but they react differently depending on which morph they have at the interfaces. So studying the system, and these are my major takeaways, and maybe I'll just leave that on the board while you ask questions, but I have my acknowledgements and references after too. So this is work that I did, as mentioned in my graduate studies with Dr. Fithiel Fletcher and Dr. Lieber.
Great.
Okay.
So, yeah, thanks very much. Let's start with maybe a question in the room here. I'm not sure that we have the sound working exactly online, so we'll start here. And if you have a question online, maybe you can type it in and we can read it out. Okay, well, I'll start with a question then. It's kind of fascinating the way the different environmental conditions affect how well the populations do, and maybe a certain set of parameters under one set of conditions would not be as good as under a different set of conditions. And so my question is, could you think about this in terms of fitness and like a game almost, where individuals are trying to sort of maximize their fitness and they're changing how they behave in a plastic way?
Yeah, in a plastic way, I think that must be that's an actual term, right?
Well, I just meant that you wouldn't, I mean, they would somehow try to optimize their behavior.
Okay, I see, yeah.
Yeah.
So certainly a really interesting question to ask, and is something that is on my mind. I am interested in, I haven't done it, but it is something that's on my mind and has absolute potential for using these numerical methods. In this 2 morphs model, and maybe Silas can help me out more here because he's more familiar with it, he approached me about it. We have a kind of changing between the 2 morphs. So there's the 2 populations and they change between the 2 morphs. So what we're hoping, what we might find here is an anomalous spreading speed where the biases help the population, or the biases on their own won't support the population persisting, but together would. So this could be, I don't know, maybe a starting point for looking at eco-evolutionary dynamics, but I would like to go forward with other options as well. I particularly for my 2D method, I'm interested in doing 2 species models. And with a 2 species model, you can always look at different eco-evolutionary, I guess, responses and see, I don't know, maybe there's one that reacts in one way and another one that changes in another way, and see if there's like a competitive advantage to the other response. So I would be interested in doing that with my two dynamic.
Cool.
Yeah.
Are there questions online? Nothing yet. Okay. Are there other questions here? I don't know when people come into the next class, so I'm just gonna stick my head out the door and see if there's a lineup or not. And there's no one lined up. Okay. So that's good. Yeah, so we have time for one more question. That's if there are any. Yeah, John.
So it seems like the alphas, your kind of tendencies to go left or right are kind of fixed. And I guess as a follow-up to the question Mark asked, if you had a kind of density dependent kind of sensitivity, how does that, would that change? Radically change?
Oh, so I see what you're saying, like, if the density is low, then they have a higher bias, and if the density is high, then
Exactly.
they.
If they're responding to, kind of perceived, density dependent, I guess.
Yeah, that's really cool. I haven't thought about it in that way, but I would note that and definitely look into that.
Because it seems like it would fit naturally in the way you've kind of framed your equations.
Mhm.
Your second term, is basically a density dependent growth term, so, you merge that with the diffusion term perhaps, for having an element and, density dependent kind of diffusion element.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't,
U del X U.
Sorry, what?
U times the partial derivative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, stuff like that.
yeah. I'm writing this down.
Okay, let's thank Jane McDonald one more time. I'd like to thank everybody online for joining, and especially our organizers at the University of Manitoba and everyone else across Western Canada. And I believe our next Menten Institute speaker is on October 7th. It's Carolyn Klein, also from Simon Fraser University. But in the meantime, we'll have some mass stat biology seminars here. Thanks once again.
Okay, thank you.
That's great. It was a two-person job. Nice talking.
Thank you. Sorry, I had to rush that again.
Oh, it's okay. It's pretty normal.
Okay.
We have a
Actually, it's
question.
the first time I'm using this. I was expecting boards of undergrads to kind of apply it in the room.